Bring in Omer Ozkizilcik. He joins me live from the Turkish capital. Omer, great to have you here with us on TRT World. Now, you are a security analyst and a non-residential fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have been closely following the developments in Syria over the past decade. Given what has happened in the last 2 weeks, do you feel Syria has a clear plan for its future? Or are we looking at yet another power struggle that is going to torn the country apart?
So we have to say that the Syrian opposition, the Syrian rebels, have prepared for this day for years. So even though the dragging out of the Syrian conflict caused incredible humanitarian casualties and humanitarian suffering, within this time, the Syrian opposition planned for the day after. And especially in the last 4 years, in the areas protected by Turkey, the Syrian rebels have established institutions, they have established a governance structure, they have established their own police apparatus, their own system, their own tax systems, and they have like a small proto-state experience of 4 years. And now they will use this experience to rule all of Syria, because the Syrian rebels are not just a bunch of civilians taking up arms, as Obama once called them, doctors and farmers with rifles in their hand. These rebels are organized force, and these organized rebels have yet to reach Damascus. Once they reach Damascus, I expect them to get in charge of what's happening in the capital and what's happening in the country. And thankfully, as the Assad fled, and the prime minister of the Assad regime accepted to communicate with Syrian rebels, there will be likely a transition period. In this transition period, it will be important to keep the state institutions alive. And for that, the Syrian rebels will use probably the knowledge and experience of the technocrats and bureaucrats of the Assad regime. And as there was no last stand fighting and no escalation in Damascus, we can expect that the transition will happen smooth. I'm quite optimistic. I think the Syrian rebels and opposition have prepared for this day, and with Assad going and with a peaceful surrender and with the cooperation of elements within the Assad regime for a transition period, we may look forward for a better and more free and more secure Syria very soon.
Omer, now, I understand your point of view here. You are optimistic about this transition period going smoothly, but given the fact that there are opposition groups within opposition groups in Syria, what are the chances of infighting taking place among them?
So the chance of an infighting happening cannot be denied. So it would be wrong to say that this will not happen. However, if you ask me what's likely, I do not expect it to happen. It appears that it's unlikely, because the Syrian rebels have learned how to work together with each other. They have come together in a joint operation room. They have come together all together. And this is the first time that we see all of the Syrian rebels pulling on the same side, working all together. And there is a momentum they are winning, and there are still many joint common interests. With the Turkish support here and with the Turkish role and with the support of the international community, I expect that the Europeans, the Arab states, even the United States of America, Russia and Iran even, could play here a constructive role for post-Assad Syria. And if the foreign actors also contribute to this, I expect that there will be no infighting between the Syrian rebels, and there will be a power sharing mechanism in the transition period. The Syrian opposition has an important card they have in their hand, and this is legitimacy. So as of now, it will be the transition process will define who's legitimate and who's not. And this is dominated by the Syrian opposition, by the legitimate political Syrian opposition. And they will use this card as a bargaining tool and to avoid internal fighting, and especially to avoid an all-out control by Hayat Tahrir Sham. Hayat Tahrir Sham will probably have to reach an agreement, a settlement with the opposition and dissolve itself, as they have already indicated that they will do. So this will open the path forward for Syria to be more prosperous.
Omer, now let me ask you the big question. What was the X factor when it comes to the downfall of the Assad regime? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, there were efforts in the past to bring him down about a decade ago, and there were three main forces that took him in power. Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. I mean, I understand why Hezbollah is weakened now and why it did not come to Assad rescue, and I would say the same for Iran. But what happened to Russia? What changed for President Putin?
So, look, we can clearly see in satellite images and from on-the-ground reporting, Russia has reached its military power limits. Russia has been heavily involved in Ukraine. They have redeployed their modern fighter jets from Syria to Ukraine. They have withdrawn many forces from Syria to Ukraine. They don't have a Wagner force on the ground that could prop up. And actually, Russia tried very hard for 7 weeks now, almost reaching the 8th week now, to stop this. We have seen intense Russian airstrikes. However, neither the quality nor the quantity was enough to prevent the fall of the Assad regime. And as you point out, rightfully, Iran and Hezbollah's weakened, but the key here for the fall of the Assad regime was its own weakness. The Assad regime was a hollow regime. It was not sustainable. It did not have a popular support. We see now that even inside the heartland of the Assad regime, what we consider to be its main popular support base, in Latakia and Tartus, people are destroying statues of Hafiz al-Assad. This is incredible. The rebels haven't reached Latakia and Tartus yet. But the civilians, the people, they go to the streets and they feel empowered to do this. And even the Alawite minority is now happy to get rid of that regime. And this shows that this Syrian conflict was only being extended by the intense Iranian and Russian support and by the reluctance of the US to do anything meaningful. It was a combination of lack of support to the Syrian opposition and the support.
Omer, if I may, about the US, do you feel the US is willing to do anything meaningful at this point? Because we have seen statements coming from both the Biden administration and President-elect Donald Trump. And it seems to me in both the statements, I did not see any strong indications that the US will be heavily involved in what comes next for Syria.
So the US has for long sidelined itself to a minor agenda in Syria that foresees the fight against ISIS. Within the Syrian civil war conflict between the opposition and the regime, the US has not been an important player for years now. And we see that this is now coming back. The US is not in an influential role here. The US does not have an important influence over what's happening in Syria right now. But I can expect that with the incoming Trump administration and with increased Turkish-American relations, that there might be a new avenue for the US to support the reconstruction of Syria, to help find more funding for the rebuilding of Syria. And probably the US will have an important role in negotiating the end of the sanctions on Syria. Once Assad is gone and we have a transition government, the US will have to abandon its sanctions on Syria as they are no longer legitimate. And here, I think the timing and the negotiations for that will be important and could bring in the US somehow back to Syria. However, as of now, the US is no longer a major player in Syria.
Omer Ozkizilcik, thanks very much for joining me today here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time. And